Welcome to The Inside Story. I'm Billy Hallowell, and I'm joined today by the Christian Post's John Brown. How you doing, John?
I'm well, Billy. Good to be with you.
Well, it's good to chat with you. You were recently out at the TPUSA Faith Pastors Summit. This was out in California. And these events, for those who don't know, they really bring together hundreds, if not thousands, depending on the event. But this particular one, hundreds of pastors from across America who come together for this summit. How was your experience? Take us through it.
It was very encouraging, I'd say, overall. As you said, lots of pastors from around the country came to hear some major figures, uh, just sort of to discuss what's going on culturally in terms of how we deal with the culture as a church, as Christians, as pastors. And I singled out some of the biggest names to cover. But what I noticed is that the thread that really ran through all of what they were saying was the sense that we're on the cusp of a revival, potentially. And there's a sense that pastors and really all Christians need to be holding the line and stop being afraid of offending people and just preach the gospel and move forward.
Yeah, I mean that and that's the interesting thing. I think a lot of people might hear TPUSA and think, "Oh, it's all politics only." But that's not really at all what this summit is. The summit is faith forward, and yes, political issues are addressed, social issues are addressed, cultural issues, but in the context and through the lens of faith, right? Of biblical faith. And so you gave a little hint to it there, but what was that the general vibe, the general feel in the room in light of the fact that there have been these cultural changes that we're seeing? Because in the past, you had a situation where a lot of people were lamenting constantly just where things were because it was so bad. And there are still a lot of things that culturally are not great, but yet there also are some moves in a very different direction. So what was the general feel in the room?
Overall, I think there was a sense that the Christians are finally making some headway in the culture after decades, really, of being on the back foot in a lot of ways. This culture has become very quickly anti-Christian in a way that I think a lot of older people, they might not even realize that at this point. But I think younger people, they almost take that for granted, Gen Z especially. It's almost taken for granted that all of our institutions are opposed to Christianity in a lot of ways. And so it'll be really interesting, and this was part of what the conference was dealing with, to see how these things play out in the future as it falls to them, to the younger people, to carry the faith forward.
Yeah, well, and it's interesting because in light of the fact that people are feeling these changes, we're also really seeing them, right? Revival, as you said, was a theme in this event. What did Greg Laurie have to say? And for those who don't know Greg Laurie, he's a well-known pastor based out in California, founder of the Harvest Crusade events that have gone around the country, holding big events, revival, quote, revival events over many decades now. But what did he have to say about what we're seeing happen in the current culture right now?
Yeah, his speech or sermon or whatever you want to call it was in a lot of ways the keynote of the whole event, in my opinion. He was very optimistic that Gen Z and the younger generation Alpha, they're very open to the gospel in ways that older generations maybe haven't been. And I think you see this in a lot of the revivals on college campuses that have happened in recent years at places like Auburn or Asbury. Gen Z and the younger people, they have a lot of struggles that other generations haven't had to deal with. But I think, ironically, those struggles have actually made them more spiritually sensitive. And Laurie knew Billy Graham personally, and he was involved with the Jesus movement in the 70s, which was one of the big revivals among the boomers. And sadly, a lot of their generation has turned away from God, but there was a faithful remnant. Laurie's a part of that, and I think they're carrying the torch to the younger generation. And Laurie talked about how he had a crusade at Angel Stadium in Anaheim recently. 45,000 people were there. The fire marshal had to lock the doors for safety reasons. There's just a huge hunger for something. And he talked about how churches really need to see these trends for what they are and focus on evangelism. And the quote that really stood out in my mind was he said, "Evangelize or fossilize." And I love that because it's such a biblical concept.
Yeah. Well, it's true. Like, and that's really, I think, what has happened in a lot of ways, because even inadvertently Christians sort of pulling back for fear of cancel culture, or even some facets of the church saying, well, we don't want to engage with culture in that way because it's so toxic, and you try to find ways to get the message out. But, Christians have really ceded ground in media, Hollywood, universities, and those are the areas where we've seen the most sort of anti-Christian, pro-secularist move forward in those areas. And now you're watching Christians regain ground in Hollywood, regain ground. I mean, look at Amazon. You've got House of David. You've got a new series coming on Joseph from Dallas Jenkins. And there's so many things happening in Hollywood media and universities that are reversing that trend. And the fossilization is no longer happening because Christians are stepping back out in those arenas. And at the same time, we are watching not just what Greg Laurie was talking about with his major event, but we're seeing kids and young people flock to faith on college campuses across the country. Another speaker at the event was Eric Metaxas, and he also talked about revival. What was his advice to the pastors in the room?
Yeah, so as I said, a lot of these speakers they echoed each other, and Metaxas talked about his quote was he thinks we're seeing the beginnings of revival, is what he said, and so he called on Christians and pastors especially to live out their faith very boldly, and of course he's written a lot about. He was the Dietrich Bonhoeffer biographer. That's how he became famous, and he's written a lot about what happened in Nazi Germany was allowed to happen because not enough Christians in that country stood up against evil. And so he was urging Christians today in this country and this culture to speak out when they can regarding the gospel's implications on critical political and cultural issues. His point was that the gospel, if it's true, it has implications for everything. And so you can't just relegate it to this one thing. You can't relegate it to church on Sundays. It has implications for politics.
Yeah, absolutely. I think and that is what people are learning. I think the reality is you can't fully step away and say, "Well, I'm just not going to pay attention to politics or the things that happen," because those things affect people's lives. They affect the way that a country functions, and that intersects with obviously people's faith, institutional faith, and all of that. So, obviously there were other elements of this as well, because in order for people to step forward, they have to do it in boldness. And so I know some of the speakers encourage pastors to be bold and how they approach evil in particular in culture, because evil is very much still present in culture. What did you hear along those lines? What did some of the speakers have to say when it came specifically to targeting evil in culture?
Well, Pastor John Amachukwu is another speaker that I covered, and he was especially big on this. He's a black pastor. He's gotten famous for pushing back against like porn in schools, critical race theory, Black Lives Matter, that sort of thing. And he's also been really outspoken about how the gospel is the only hope for not just the black community, but for every community. And so he pushed back against people who have criticized him over the years for his tone. And he was essentially saying, I'm not going to fight about this anymore. Like these are very serious issues, and we need to be forceful in our tone. And then Pastor Jack Hibbs, he sort of had some of the same message. He talked about how pastors, especially, need to push back against evil done by the government, especially. And he singled out this new bill in California that he and some other pastors protested this week at the state capitol, which essentially allows, he argues, for kidnapping. It allows a caregiver who's not this child's parent to take custody of them. And so things like that, when the government oversteps and when the political realm steps into the church's realm, it's the church's job to push back. And I think that was the major emphasis.
So, as a reporter who covered this event, why do you think it's important? Why do you think events like TPUSA Faith are actually important, not just in general, but specifically when it comes to the place where we're at right now in the culture?
I think it's important for pastors to come together just to refocus on the bigger picture. I think a lot of times pastors can get bogged down in the battles they're facing in their own churches, and a lot of times these battles are very petty. And I know for a fact that a lot of pastors often feel very alone. So I think events like this can provide encouragement and perspective. It's almost like zooming out to look at the larger spiritual war that we're in. And I think there's lots of reasons to believe that we're making progress in this culture, especially, as I said, among young people. And so I think it's really crucial that pastors and Christians generally don't lose sight of that, despite all the discouragements that we face along the way.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And, there's so much there, but these events are important to be able to focus in, especially having faith leaders come in, right? That's what's unique about this. You have pastors who are leading their flocks, coming together, sharing their thoughts on what they're experiencing, and hearing from so many of the thought leaders in the space. John, appreciate you joining us today and breaking it all down.
Good to see you.
Everyone else, make sure you tune in next week for another episode of The Inside Story and head over to the Christian Post. You can go to christianpost.com. We'll see you next week for another episode.